The will my cousin brought to the table was dated 11 days before my father died. Derek slid it across Aunt Marion's dining room in front of 9 relatives and said, "Your dad finally put the farm with someone who could run it." He kept one hand on page 4 while explaining why no one should waste time calling the attorney who held Dad's older papers. I said nothing because a small detail near the signature had pulled me back to a conversation Derek did not know had happened. He was still claiming victory when I realized exactly which person needed to see that page. If you have ever been treated like the quiet relative who could be written out because you would not make a scene, stay with me until the end. Because the truth in this story did not arrive through shouting. It arrived through a notary journal, a real trust, and one woman who remembered exactly who my father had brought into the room. My name is Maya Collins. I was 33, and I worked as an account clerk for a small county clinic. I spent my days matching numbers, dates, signatures, and records that other people thought were boring until something went wrong. I was also my father's only child, though my cousin Derek spent years acting like proximity to land mattered more than blood, care, or law. Let me back up. My father, Henry Collins, owned a low white farmhouse outside Briar Glen, 14 acres of pasture, a machine shed, a small apple stand, and the 2-room cabin where my grandfather had lived after my grandmother died. The land had been in our family since 1984, when my grandparents bought it with a bank loan and 19 years of stubborn payments. Dad inherited it in 2006, but he always said he was only the keeper, not the owner in the grand sense. He was a careful man. He saved bent nails, labeled jars of screws, and kept every tax receipt in a green metal box under his desk. After my mother died in 2015, he became even more careful. Not because he loved paper more than people, but because people had started treating his grief like an opening. He used to say, "Paper is not love, Maya, but it keeps love from being talked over." Derek was my father's sister's son. He was 38, loud, charming in public, and always just close enough to Dad to look loyal without being dependable. He stopped by when hay needed cutting, if someone had already done the hardest part. He brought coffee when he wanted to ask about the shed. He called Dad Uncle Henry in that soft voice people use when they are already reaching for something. When Dad's arthritis got bad, Derek began telling people he was the one keeping the place going. That was not true. I arranged the medication, paid the property taxes from Dad's account with him beside me, handled the apple stand deposits, and drove him to appointments. Our neighbor Silas mowed the steep pasture. Derek replaced one gate latch and told half the county he was saving the farm. Dad knew. He knew more than people gave him credit for. In 2021, after a fall in the machine shed left him with 6 stitches and a fear he tried to hide, he asked me to drive him to an attorney named Ms. Ralston. I sat in the waiting room with a paper cup of coffee while he signed a trust agreement, a pour-over will, and a deed transferring the farmhouse, pasture, shed, stand, and cabin into the Collins family trust. The notary that day was Mrs. Evelyn Porter, a retired bank clerk who worked part-time in Ms. Ralston's office. She had silver hair, square glasses, and a habit of repeating names before she wrote them. When Dad signed the trustee paperwork, she looked at my driver's license because I was named successor trustee and future beneficiary. Then she said, "Maya Elaine Collins, daughter of Henry Collins." Dad corrected her gently, "Only child." Mrs. Porter smiled. "That is worth writing correctly. I remember that because Dad looked embarrassed and proud at the same time." On the way home, he told me he had named me successor trustee, delayed any sale for 24 months after his death, and left Derek nothing beyond a $5,000 gift for help he had actually given. The property would eventually benefit me, with small cash gifts to Aunt Marion and 2 cousins, but my job was to preserve it first. I told him Derek would explode. Dad looked out the window at the winter fields and said, "Derek believes volume is evidence. Let him learn paper has a quieter memory." He asked me to keep the details quiet. He did not want Derek's visits to become theatrical kindness. He did not want Aunt Marion, who loved peace more than truth, to spend his last years begging him to make everyone happy. And he did not want me forced to defend a role before it was time to use it. The signing day stayed with me in small pieces. Mrs. Porter had a little brass ruler on her desk, and she used it to keep the signature pages straight. Dad teased her for being more precise than the courthouse, and she said, "Precision is cheaper than confusion." He laughed at that, but then his face grew serious when she placed the trust certification in front of him. Before he signed, he asked Ms. Ralston to read the delayed sale clause aloud one more time. She read that the land could not be sold, leased for business use, mortgaged, or divided for 24 months after his death without my written approval and attorney notice. She read that the machine shed and cabin were part of the trust property. She read that any person attempting to use an outdated document or unverified copy would be required to produce the original for review. Dad nodded after every sentence. "You understand this may frustrate relatives who expected a faster answer," Ms. Ralston said. "Fast answers are how families lose land," Dad said. Mrs. Porter wrote something in her journal, then turned it toward Dad so he could sign the notary entry. I remember his hand shaking, not from doubt, but from the arthritis in his fingers. When he finished, he tapped the line with my name on it. "Maya has patience," he said. "I do not know whether she knows it yet." I looked away because praise from him always made me feel younger than I was. Mrs. Porter looked at me then and said, "Patience is useful in records. It lets the ink dry before people start arguing with it." That scene embarrassed me at the time. Later, when Derek stood in Aunt Marion's dining room with a false document and a borrowed confidence, I would think of ink drying. I would think of Mrs. Porter turning her journal toward Dad. I would think of how carefully he had made truth boring enough to last. The first small overreach came 7 months before Dad died. I arrived after work and found Derek in the machine shed with a clipboard and a man I did not know. The man was measuring the concrete pad and asking about electric service. Dad was in the kitchen, asleep with his hand wrapped around a mug of tea. "What is going on?" I asked. Derek grinned like I had interrupted a surprise party. "Just getting a quote. This shed could hold equipment for my landscaping business if we clean out the junk. It is Dad's shed. It is family property," he said. "You always forget the family part when it gets in your way." The man with the tape measure looked uncomfortable and left after I asked whether Dad had authorized the visit. Derek waited until the truck was gone before turning on me. "You cannot keep everyone out just because you moved back into town and started playing nurse." That was how he reduced care to a performance. I lived 18 minutes away, not in the farmhouse. I had not moved into anything. But Derek knew stories worked best when they made the listener tired before the facts arrived. The second pressure thread came through Aunt Marion. She was Dad's older sister, 67, and she had a soft spot for Derek that had survived every unpaid loan and half-finished promise. Derek began telling her Dad had promised him the cabin because he was the only one who would keep a Collins man on the land. Marion called me one evening nervous and apologetic. "Maya, did your father ever mention Derek getting the cabin?" "No. Derek says your dad told him after Christmas." "Did Dad say it in front of you?" She hesitated. "No. But Derek sounded sure. Derek often sounds sure." Marion sighed. "He says if you control everything, you will sell the farm to strangers." That hurt because I had spent years helping Dad keep it from becoming exactly that. But I did not tell Marion about the trust. I only said, "Ask Derek for writing before you carry his certainty for him." The bigger overreach came 6 weeks before Dad died. He was in the hospital with a lung infection, weak but alert, and Derek showed up with a folded paper titled Farm Transition Plan. He said it was just a way to help everyone think clearly. The plan had him living in the cabin, using the shed for his business, and managing the apple stand while I received reasonable sentimental access to the farmhouse. Dad read the first page and put it down. "Derek," he said, "this is not a plan. It is a taking." Derek's face changed. "I am trying to keep your name alive." Dad looked at him for a long time. "My name is not alive because you put trucks in my shed." Derek blamed me after that. In the hallway, he stepped close enough for me to smell mint gum on his breath and said, You have him scared of everyone who is not you." "He is not scared," I said. "Then why does he keep hiding behind you?" I wanted to say because he trusts me. I did not. Dad had asked me to let the right document speak when the time came. I went back into his room, adjusted his blanket, and pretended my hands were not shaking. Dad died at 3 in the morning on a Sunday in his own bed with the hall light on and rain tapping the kitchen window. I was asleep in the recliner beside him and woke because his breathing had changed. For a few minutes after he passed, the house was only quiet. No claims, no land, no arguments, just my father, finally beyond pain. I called hospice, then Ms. Ralston, then Aunt Marion. Derek arrived before the funeral home, wearing work boots and a clean jacket. He hugged me with one arm and looked over my shoulder toward Dad's desk. "Where is the green box?" he asked. "Why? Your dad kept important things there." "The attorney has the originals." Derek's face barely moved, but his eyes sharpened. "Of course you already called the attorney." "Dad asked me to." He gave a short laugh. "I am sure he did." The funeral was 5 days later. Derek carried the casket with dramatic seriousness and shook hands like he was already hosting the family. At the lunch afterward, I heard him telling 2 cousins that the farm needed a practical operator, not a bookkeeper with feelings. Aunt Marion told me he was grieving in his own way. I told her grief does not need a measuring tape. Ms. Ralston scheduled the formal estate meeting for the following Tuesday at 11. She sent written notice to me, Aunt Marion, Derek, his sister Jenna, and 2 other relatives. The notice said original documents would be reviewed and no copy should be relied upon without verification. That sentence mattered more than anyone knew yet. Derek did not wait until Tuesday. On Monday evening, Aunt Marion called and asked me to come to her house because Derek had found something. Her voice sounded small. I almost said no, but Jenna texted me a minute later. "Please come. He is saying Dad changed everything." I went. There were 9 relatives in Marion's dining room, with paper plates of untouched food on the sideboard. Derek stood at the head of the table with a 4-page will. He had already made copies. The document left the farmhouse, shed, pasture, cabin, and apple stand to him, for continuity of family operation. It left me my mother's wedding dishes, Dad's clock, and $100. I looked at the signature line first. Dad's name was there, shaky but recognizable. Then I looked at the notary stamp. Evelyn Porter. My stomach tightened. "Where did this come from?" I asked. Derek tapped the page. "Dad gave it to me after the hospital. He knew you would fight it. Mrs. Porter notarized this." That is what the stamp says. Jenna, Derek's younger sister, looked pale. "Derek, why did you not take it to Ms. Ralston?" He shot her a look. "Because Maya would bury it in procedure." Then he turned to me and smiled, with a kind of triumph I had never seen on his face before. "Go ahead. Say it. My cousin forged Dad's will until the notary remembered me. Is that the story you were about to invent?" That was the breaking point. He had handed me the title of his own undoing as an insult. For 1 second, I wanted to snatch the paper and hold it up to the room. The stamp was wrong. Mrs. Porter's commission date looked strange. The paper had no attorney file number. Dad's middle initial was missing on page 2. Every record-trained part of my brain was awake and shouting. But I remembered Dad's voice in the truck after the trust signing. Derek believes volume is evidence. Let him learn paper has a quieter memory. So I did not shout. I did not call him a liar. I took one photo of the notary page while Derek was still enjoying the room, then set the document back on the table. "Bring it tomorrow," I said. Derek laughed. "That is all. That is enough." My quiet decision was to let the real chain of records do its work. From my car outside Marion's house, I sent the photo to Ms. Ralston and wrote that Derek had produced a new will, dated 11 days before Dad's death, allegedly notarized by Mrs. Porter. Ms. Ralston replied within 6 minutes. "Do not confront him further. Attend tomorrow. I will contact the notary." That was the action. No threats, no accusations in a dining room full of relatives. I preserved the image, notified the attorney, and allowed the formal review to proceed. Miss Ralston also asked me to bring my copy of the 2021 notice, Dad's keyring, and the green tax box if it was still at the house. For a few hours, everything looked falsely calm. Derek texted the family group that the farm would stay with someone practical, and that he hoped I would not make my grief difficult. Aunt Marion replied with a folded hands message. Jenna did not reply at all. I sat at Dad's kitchen table with the green box in front of me, sorting receipts because motion felt safer than rage. Then the complication surfaced. Silas, the neighbor who mowed the steep pasture, knocked on the back door at 8 that night. Derek had called him and said the mowing arrangement was over because he was taking over operations. He had also asked Silas where Dad kept the spare cabin key. I told him to ask you, Silas said. Thank you. Silas shifted his cap in both hands. Henry told me once, if anything happened, listen for the quiet one. I guess that was you. That almost broke me. I wrote down the time of Derek's call, took a statement from Silas, and placed it in the green box. The false will had already started acting like permission. Dad had been right to build a paper wall around the land. The next morning at 11, we sat in Ms. Ralston's office. Derek looked confident. Aunt Marion looked frightened. Jenna sat beside the window with her hands clasped. Mrs. Porter was there too, which Derek had not expected. She wore the same square glasses and carried a black notary journal with a worn elastic strap. Derek frowned. Why is she here? Miss Ralston said. Because the document you produced claims her notarial act. Mrs. Porter looked at the 4-page will, then at Derek. I did notarize this. The room went still. Derek leaned forward. Your stamp is on it. A stamp image is on it, she said. My commission expiration shown there is wrong. My commission renewed 2 months before that date. Also, I never notarize without a journal entry. She opened the black book. The sound of those pages turning was small, but it changed the room more than shouting could have. She found the date on Derek's document. There was no entry for Henry Collins. Then she turned back to February 18, 2021. This is the day Mr. Collins signed the trust documents, she said. I remember him. Derek scoffed. You remember every old man who signs paper? Mrs. Porter's eyes lifted. No. I remember the ones who correct me with pride. Then she looked at me. He brought Maya Elaine Collins. I said daughter of Henry Collins. He said only child. Aunt Marion put one hand over her mouth. Jenna closed her eyes. Derek's face emptied before anger rushed in to fill it. Miss Ralston read the real documents next. The 2021 will revoked all prior wills and poured remaining assets into the Collins family trust. The deed transferred the farmhouse, pasture, machine shed, apple stand, and cabin into the trust. I was named successor trustee. No sale, lease, mortgage, business use, or property transfer could occur for 24 months after Dad's death without my written consent and attorney notice. Derek's gift was $5,000, conditioned on no interference with trust property. The fallout came in waves. First, Aunt Marion whispered, Henry never said. Then Ms. Ralston answered, he was not required to. Jenna asked whether the cabin was protected too, and Ms. Ralston said yes. Derek demanded to know whether the forged will could still be considered Dad's intent, and Ms. Ralston told him carefully that a document with a false notarial certificate and no valid execution would not control trust property. Derek stood up. You are all acting like I made it up. Mrs. Porter closed her journal. Someone did. That was the cleanest sentence in the room. Ms. Ralston did not accuse Derek of a crime in front of us. She did something colder and more useful. She placed the question document in a clear sleeve, marked the time she received it, copied Mrs. Porter's journal entry from 2021, and told Derek not to remove, destroy, or alter any related paper or message. She also gave him written notice that he had no authority over the property. Derek's confidence began to look like a jacket he had outgrown. He asked for a private call with his own attorney. Ms. Ralston said he was free to seek counsel. Aunt Marion began crying, not loudly, but with the exhausted grief of someone realizing peace had been purchased by refusing to see the truth. The reveal happened after the meeting, but not with Derek. It happened with Jenna, in the parking lot beside my car. She had stayed behind while Derek walked to his truck and slammed the door. "Maya," she said, "did you know all along? I knew Dad named me trustee. I did not know Derek would produce a forged will." Did Uncle Henry hate Derek? No. He saw him clearly. Jenna looked down at the asphalt. Derek asked me to say I remembered Dad talking about him getting the cabin. I told him I did not remember. He said I never support him. Thank you for not lying. Her eyes filled. I should have warned you sooner. You texted me to come. That felt small. Small truth is still truth. She nodded, but her mouth trembled. Mom believed him because she wanted him to finally become the man he says he is. I know. What happens now? The real trust happens. And Derek has to decide whether he wants to keep making this worse. Jenna wiped her cheek. Then I am going to stop helping him make it easier. The turn came that evening. Derek gathered Aunt Marion and 2 cousins at her house, trying to frame the meeting as a misunderstanding. He said the notary was old, Ms. Ralston was biased, and I had probably arranged everything before Dad died. Jenna called me afterward and told me what happened, but this time she did not sound frightened. I told him to stop, she said. What did he say? He said family should stand together. And you? I said family does not mean standing beside a fake signature. I sat down at Dad's kitchen table because my knees suddenly felt weak. Jenna continued. Mom cried. Derek yelled. Then I asked him where he got the notary stamp image. What did he say? Nothing. That nothing did more than another denial. It gave Aunt Marion a place to begin doubting the son she had defended for years. The next 30 days were careful and formal. Ms. Ralston filed the real will with the probate court, recorded my trustee acceptance, and sent beneficiary notices. She preserved Derek's document and referred him to his own counsel. I opened a trust account, renewed the Apple stand permit, paid the property insurance, and sent written notice to Silas that his mowing arrangement remained unchanged. Ms. Ralston also came to the farmhouse with me to inventory the places Derek had tried to claim. We started in the machine shed because that was where the first measuring tape had appeared. She photographed the doors, the tool racks, the tractor attachments, the old compressor, and the wall where Dad had marked floodwater heights in pencil. Silas came over to witness the condition of the shed because he knew which items had been there for years. Henry never threw anything away, Silas said. He knew what things were for, I answered. Ms. Ralston wrote that down, not because it was legal language, but because she said memory often helps explain why property should not be rushed into boxes. Then we walked to the cabin. The spare key Derek had asked about was not under the loose porch board where he thought it would be. Dad had moved it into the green box years earlier. Inside the cabin, everything smelled like cedar and dust. A fishing coat hung behind the door. A stack of old seed catalogs sat on the table. I stood there longer than I meant to. Miss Ralston waited. He was afraid Derek would turn this into storage, I said. Then we will record it as residential family property, she said, not business overflow. Those words were plain, but they steadied me. Every label was a small defense against Derek's version of usefulness. The apple stand was last. Dad had written prices in chalk on a board he repainted every fall. I found a folded note in the cash drawer with my name on it. It was only one sentence. Keep it open if you can, but not at the cost of peace. I read it twice, then gave it to Ms. Ralston to copy for the trust file. Even affection had to be preserved carefully now. Derek's attorney contacted Ms. Ralston 2 weeks later. The story changed. Derek now claimed Dad had given him draft language and that he had assembled it into a document after Dad died because he believed it reflected Dad's wishes. The notary stamp, his attorney said, had been copied from an old land paper by mistake. Miss Ralston's response was brief. Mistakes do not create wills. There were legal consequences I did not control. The question document went where such documents go when attorneys decide the court should know. But inside the family, the damage required a different kind of repair. Aunt Marion came to the farmhouse 1 month after the meeting. She brought a casserole I did not need, and an apology she barely knew how to carry. She stood in the kitchen where Dad used to drink tea and looked smaller than she had at the funeral. "I believed Derek because it was easier," she said. I did not answer quickly. "I wanted Henry to have left him something important," she continued. "I thought maybe if Derek had responsibility, he would become responsible. Dad knew responsibility does not work that way." Marion nodded. "I know that now. Do you?" She looked at me then. I should have asked why the paper made me ignore the man I knew my brother was. That was the first apology that mattered. Not because it fixed everything, but because she named the choice she had made. I told her Dad had left her his mother's walnut sewing table and $15,000. She cried when I said it. "He remembered the table? He said you hid under it during thunderstorms." Marion covered her face. "I thought he stopped remembering me." "He remembered. He just did not give you the land." Those two truths sat together without destroying each other. Derek did not come to me for 3 months. When he finally did, it was through Ms. Ralston's office, in a conference room with his attorney present. He looked thinner, less polished, and angry in a tired way. He signed a written disclaimer of any claim under the forged document, agreed not to contact tenants or vendors, returned the cabin key he had taken from Marion's drawer, and accepted that his $5,000 gift would be held until the estate confirmed no further interference. Then Ms. Ralston asked if he wanted to say anything not legally required. His attorney looked uncomfortable. Derek stared at the table. "I thought if I had the farm, people would finally see I was not a screw-up," he said. No one spoke. "Uncle Henry never trusted me with anything big." I said, "He trusted what you showed him." Derek flinched, but he did not argue. "I copied the stamp from an old paper," he said. I told myself he was just making official what he should have done. Aunt Marion made a sound beside me, like someone had pressed on a bruise. Ms. Ralston said, "That is enough for today." It was not forgiveness. It was accountability starting in the only place it could, with the lie no longer protected by performance. Before he left, Derek pushed a folded paper across the table. It was a list of every person he had shown the false will to, including 2 neighbors and the man who had measured the shed. Miss Ralston took it without praise and said she would send corrective notices. Derek looked at me then, not pleading, not proud. "I cannot fix the part where I made them doubt you," he said. "No," I answered. "But you can stop feeding the doubt." He nodded once. His attorney looked relieved. Aunt Marion finally exhaled. No one hurried the silence after that. That was the first time I had seen him accept a limit without turning it into an insult. The resolution took time. Derek did not get the farm. He did not get the shed, the cabin, or a heroic story about misunderstood intentions. But he did agree to pay the estate for the cost of reviewing the false document, and he wrote Aunt Marion a letter admitting he had used her belief in him to pressure the family. She kept that letter in her Bible, not as proof that he was redeemed, but as proof that he had finally written one true thing. Jenna became the bridge none of us expected. She sat with Marion when the shame hit hardest, and she came to the farmhouse when I needed another witness for inventory. One afternoon, she found a stack of photographs in the cabin drawer, most of them from summers when Derek and I were children. In one picture, Dad was teaching Derek to sharpen a pocket knife while I sat on the porch steps eating an apple. Jenna held it up. "He did give Derek time." "A lot of it," I said. "Derek talks like he was always left outside." "Sometimes people stand in the doorway and call it exile." She gave a tired laugh. "That sounds like something Uncle Henry would have said." Maybe it was. Maybe families inherit phrases the way they inherit furniture, scratched and useful. Jenna helped me reopen the apple stand that fall. We painted the sign, cleaned the counter, and put Dad's old cash box under the shelf. Silas mowed the pasture. Marion brought the walnut sewing table home after the inventory. Derek stayed away, which was the kindest thing he could do for a while. On the first anniversary of Dad's death, Mrs. Porter came by the stand to buy apples. She was retired fully by then, walking with a cane and wearing the same square glasses. I gave her a bag without charging. She tried to argue. "Please," I said, "you remembered me." She shook her head. "I remembered your father remembering you. There is a difference." That sentence stayed with me because it was exactly right. The notary did not make me his daughter. The trust did not make me loved. The journal did not create the truth. It preserved it when someone tried to cover it with a stamp. 2 years later, the farm was still in the trust. The shed housed Dad's tools, not Derek's trucks. The cabin became a small family retreat by reservation, with rules written so nobody could claim confusion. Marion came out on Sundays sometimes and sat by the apple stand. Jenna brought her children to pick fruit. Derek came once, near closing, and asked if he could buy a basket. I sold it to him. We did not talk long. He said he was working steady hours for someone else's landscaping crew and learning to show up before asking for more. I said Dad would have respected the showing up. Derek looked down and said, "I wish I had done that first." So did I. Legacy is not protected by suspicion alone, and it is not destroyed by one dishonest page. It survives when the people entrusted with memory are careful enough to keep dates, names, seals, and small truths intact, until love can no longer be talked over. My cousin forged Dad's will, until the notary remembered me and my father's real wishes found their voice again.